George A. Romero's Resident Evil was always a piece of history that fascinated me as a fan, because growing up, I was always a fan of two things: horror films and survival horror on the PS1 era. And Romero's films kind of went alongside my love with Resident Evil throughout the years. The first three Dead films from Romero are some of my favorite horror films of all time, along with the remake of Night of the Living Dead from 1990. Although the remake was only written by Romero, but Tom Savini was handpicked by Romero to direct it, this also inspired Capcom for some of the imagery, camera angles, along with the music for Resident Evil 1. Romero's influence on the horror genre is not a mystery to many fans at this point if you are tapped into the horror community. The legacy this man left behind will be something that will influence up-and-coming filmmakers forever. The whole lore behind George Romero's Resident Evil was something I was always fascinated by once I found out about it when I started to use the internet in the early 2000s, even though I was a few years late to the party, and at this point, Paul Anderson's film was well underway, but I was always intrigued by his script and what could have been on his take on the first Resident Evil. Unfortunately, it never happened, and this documentary, directed by Brandon Salisbury, dives into the lore of this time period of the late 90s, with the origin and beginnings of Resident Evil with Capcom to the heightened popularity of Resident Evil 2, which was right around the time Capcom wanted to give a live-action Resident Evil a green light. George Romero jumped on a project that was very much inspired by his work from the beginning, so it was basically a perfect storm of events. The documentary does a good job at really showing the impact that George Romero had on fans across the world, and really shows how significant Night of the Living Dead was for knocking the doors down for everything after the fact. It gives viewers a perfect insight as to why his work was important and how it made an impact throughout the world of zombies as we know them. Without George, there would not be Resident Evil, plain and simple. The documentary really executes exploring the origins of the Resident Evil franchise that is about to turn 29 at the time of this recording, and it showcases where it all started from within Capcom. Going through the game Sweet Home, and the success they originally wanted from that title was not really met, so they didn't have the rights to continue with that Sweet Home name, so they decided to start something completely new with an original idea that became one of the most influential survival horror games ever made. I think it's really cool that this documentary takes its time and explains to viewers the history of Resident Evil as well as Romero's career, because whether you're coming into this documentary knowing all about Resident Evil and not much about Romero, you're going to get a history lesson, and vice versa. So I think anybody coming into this documentary with different sides of the fan base, you definitely will get a bunch of knowledge and a nice little history lesson of the late 90s with Romero's involvement and Resident Evil. One of my favorite segments from the documentary is when they dive into even more detail on Romero directing the infamous Biohazard 2 commercial in Japan, which was something that was completed and was Romero's first shot at making his own footprint in the world of Resident Evil and Resident Evil 2 specifically. It was such a cool thing to hear from people that were working around him at the time or on the set of the commercial. Various storyboards, photos, along with behind-the-scenes footage was a cool treat for us Romero and Resident Evil fans alike. The commercial itself would lead Romero to actually be hired to write a full script based on the first Resident Evil game. I actually never knew that Romero shot enough footage for the Biohazard 2 commercial that actually almost made a short film's length of footage. So he actually did screen this privately to people that he knew, and it was about 10 or 15 minutes. And I would love to see that footage because it's definitely out there somewhere or somebody has it, and we've yet to see it. But it would be really cool to see a 10 to 15 minute RE2 type short film that Romero got from just the 30 seconds or a minute and a half ad that we ended up getting in Japan. So I'm curious to see where that footage is and if we'll ever see it, but it's a really cool fact about the Biohazard 2 commercial. I also really appreciated that this documentary did not shy away from how big Resident Evil 2 was when it was released, which really made Resident Evil a household name in the late 90s. After being scrapped from what RE fans know as Resident Evil 1.5 to the final version that we got of Resident Evil 2, the history behind that game is always fascinating. Once it was released, it broke several records, selling 400,000 copies and earning more than $19 million in just 72 hours. Resident Evil 2 broke sale records of games like Final Fantasy VII and Super Mario 64. There's a reason why this is considered one of the best sequels of all time. This documentary showcased the original draft of Resident Evil that was written before George's involvement. This script was written by Alan McElroy, which really had a different vibe entirely compared to Romero's script. There was elements of the first game in there, but it was vastly different, like replacing the S.T.A.R.S team with just a traditional SWAT team and not the characters that we know and love. It's very cool to see the history of the behind-the-scenes discussions or interviews that link the timeline, so we actually have some context as to when some of these projects were supposed to roll out. And the documentary wasn't jumping all over the place. The project knew how to tell how these events unfolded and how they played out in order of Romero's career and also Resident Evil. One of the reasons why we couldn't wait to see this documentary was because we couldn't wait to see how they were going to break down the Romero script and go in detail with different things that he added, different things that he kept the same from the original game, and really get somewhat of an explanation as to why people think he made the choices that he made when writing the draft of the script. We did get a good 15 minutes or so of going through Romero's actual script, but I do wish this segment was done with a little bit better of a pacing. Instead, we got someone talking through a radio explaining the script in a very fast manner, and I wish it could have been a little bit more slowed down. Maybe pass around to different people explaining the meat and potatoes of the script section by section. Now, obviously, there is a lot to go through when you're looking at his draft of the script, and yes, we could just read it ourselves to get the full context, but where I'm getting at is that it would have been cool to really dive into it a bit slower paced so everybody can understand how that script was presented, and the segment would have been a little bit more fulfilling for me personally if it was done in that way, but that's just my opinion. I know the documentary runs about an hour and 51 minutes with credits, and it does have to cover a lot of ground here. So there's only so much time that you can put in for the whole script breakdown, but maybe we could have had a deep dive last a little bit longer. Maybe the individual narrating it over the radio could have maybe slowed down his pacing, depending on how the direction was for him to read the breakdown of the script. It would have just been cool to hear from different people as it jumps around different sections of said script, and it wouldn't have to have just been from one guy with a radio effect over his voice. It just would have fit a little bit better, in my opinion, if we slowed it down a little bit and made that part of the pacing a little bit more balanced. With all of that being said, I do appreciate that we got something that does explain the history of before and after the deal was made with Romero, as Romero being fired is chalked up to creative differences from an interview he gave with Fangoria magazine and others. But the thing is, inside the studio, it was a different story, because the executives were saying, oh, it was going to be too violent to be officially made, and obviously a big falling out with the top dogs of the company. A complete disconnect from big studio executives versus the outsider, who actually had a vision for this project based off the game. There seems to be a lot of factors that were out of Romero's control, and even with his history that he had behind him, it's still hard for a voice to be heard. Wrapping everything up, this is a great documentary that I think fans of Romero and Resident Evil will enjoy, and they can take a trip down memory lane of a cherished time in the late 90s, when we actually got iconic games being released back then, breaking new ground, and some of the ideas and projects that could have been. The people they got that were either part of the George A. Romero Foundation or individuals who worked with him or just super fans did bring a lot of insight and perspective to this project. The B-roll and the cinematography was also very well done and captured that old school retro vibe of the late 90s aesthetic. I think Pablo Kuntz, who played the original Albert Wesker in Resident Evil 1, did a fantastic job narrating this documentary. And for the music side of things, Dwayne Merritt, who did the music for The Keeper's Diary, also did the music for this documentary, who did a fantastic job. Shout out to Brandon Salisbury, who directed this documentary, as well as writing it, along with Robbie McGregor. You could tell the people involved with this project and helped get it across the finish line were true Romero and Resident Evil fans, and that's definitely something that you can feel when watching this documentary. This film carried a lot of well-done research, and the timeline of events is laid out perfectly through Romero's career and the Resident Evil timeline, so it doesn't bounce all around and confuse the viewer. It does tell things in that precise order, which is great, because this is a very special piece of horror history that never was. So whether you're a Resident Evil fan or a George A. Romero fan, you definitely want to check out this documentary. Take care. Smash that like button if you're new. Subscribe, and I'll catch all of you in the next one. Take care.